Hello, my name is Greg J. Smith. I'm a Canadian writer and cultural worker with Holo. Today I'm joined by Montreal-based curator and researcher Maurice Jones, who I'll introduce shortly. This is the fourth episode of the 2024 edition of Alt History, which is an online speaker series we began last year. In it, we turn to folks on the bleeding edge of art and technology to help us understand lost and forgotten moments in digital culture. So with this alt history nomenclature, I'm just talking about this idea that we're all quite familiar with. New technologies and cultural developments often come with an erasure. We forget about why or how we used to do things and maybe what words or communities meant. So with the series, we've been addressing moments, practices, and labor that have faded from memory or been outright forgotten over the last 3 decades. And we're not just trying to revel in nostalgia here, but also critically engage this erasure or forgetting and use it to make sense of the present. This series is brought to you by Generation, Braga, Portugal-based space for creation, performance, and exhibition within the domain of contemporary music and the relationship between art and technology, and my team at Holo. We're an editorial and curatorial platform founded in 2012, focused on emerging trajectories in art, science, and technology. And these interests manifest themselves in a few ways. We make big, beefy digital art periodicals online at holo.mg. We track interdisciplinary practice kind of day in, day out. And then through collaborations with cultural partners, exactly like you're watching today. So many thanks to Generation for the invitation to host this series, which has been a lot of fun. I guess we're almost like 1.75 years into this project, and this is the 9th of 10 conversations. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by Maurice Jones today, a collaborator and friend. And he's going to be critically reflecting on the origins of techno, which is thorny and contested. And obviously, maybe for folks that aren't that familiar with it, it's a future-forward genre of electronic music with deep roots in America and Germany, and all kinds of complicated transatlantic influences. So Maurice is a curator, producer, and researcher based in Montreal, Canada. He's currently a PhD candidate at Concordia University, where he's researching transcultural perceptions of AI, public participation in technology, and the ideas of festivals as temporary utopias. And I'm sure this will come up a little bit in our conversations today. He was the artistic director of MUTEK Tóquio from 2016 to 2022. And since 2021, he's been working with MUTEK HQ in Montreal, working on the professional program of the MUTEK Forum and the transnational think tank, Future Festivals. So thanks so much for joining us today, Maurice. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot for having me, Greg. It's a very important work you're doing with the alt history series, and I'm very happy to be contributing to this today with a kind of case study. It's a very personal kind of story, situating myself as a person of color that grew up in the German countryside. That fell in love with electronic music in the Frankfurt kind of scene, and what tying that to my personal history to the history of electronic dance music more broadly, and the kind of similarities and metaphors that that I want to unravel. So I'm by no means like a historian or an expert, but I think I have a lived experience that I try to unravel through this story. So I want to start with this place. So in 2021, the Museum of Modern Electronic Music, or short MoMEM, opened its doors in Frankfurt at the Hauptwache Square. And this was raved as a significant moment for the electronic music scene, as it was proclaimed to be the establishment of the world's first museum dedicated to techno. So finally, the genre was getting its official recognition in Germany, the country where the pulsing uns of kick drums and snares had found a strong foothold in the global music scene. So at the time, Moment's director Alex Azari, who is himself kind of a pioneer, like an important figure of the Frankfurt club scene himself, echoed this sentiment in a public video produced by a German music outlet, where he said, and I quote, "There are museums for a lot of other kinds of music, but there's nothing like that at all for the field of electronic music, techno, house, club culture." So for many in Germany, this was seen as a long overdue acknowledgement of the country's role in electronics music rise. And the situation kind of escalated when Peter Feldman, at the time the mayor of Frankfurt, sent an invitation for Moment's opening party, welcoming guests in the middle of Frankfurt, where techno has its origin. So this kind of set up a conflagration in the fiercely protective techno community. So it was the Female Pressure, a global consortium of women, non-binary, and trans electronic music artists who wrote an open letter condemning what they saw as the patriarchal whitewashing of a genre created by non-white and queer artists. And they stated, should the claim be a pure marketing measure, the letter stated, it inadmissibly exploits the cultures of people with histories of migration and oppression by marginalizing their achievements. And it went all the way to like the New York Times writing an article about the battle over techno's origins. So while I think these condemnations and like the kind of reaction by groups, not only Female Pressure, but groups that have similar kind of viewpoints, are very important and very well placed, I believe that there was an aspect to it that rather than adding to a more differentiated view of the histories of electronic dance music, they at the same time added into like fueling like very binary positions of like, okay, and like this was invented here and then it was appropriated somewhere else, which is not really what happened. So I'm always kind of like both sides kind of took the misstep of like blindly applying the techno label to any kind of electronic music, and rather than kind of unraveling like the different traditions or the different kind of evolutions that happened at different times, and both sides kind of flattened that into like, okay, we just call any electronic music techno and it was invented in Detroit, and the others say it was invented in Germany, and then you have the kind of battle over techno's origins, which is not really the battle that we should be having, because there's very specific situated unique histories of the genres, how they interplayed with each other, how they cross-fertilized each other, how they interpreted and like helped each other evolve in many ways. So that's what I want to get into a bit today, a bit complicating the history, not necessarily having the answers to any of this, but maybe asking more questions about where we should be looking. So when this controversy came out of across the Atlantic in Detroit, the founders of underground resistance, the label behind the world's actual first techno museum, Exhibit 3000, took notice. So Exhibit 3000 is located on Detroit's Grand Boulevard, and it has been preserving the history of techno since 2002. It was created by the pioneers, Mike Banks, also known as Mad Mike, and DJ and producer John Collins. They're now in their 50s and 60s, and they established the museum to ensure that the true story of techno's Detroit origins wasn't forgotten or erased as the genre grew in popularity worldwide. And I'll be playing like a few tracks throughout this presentation to also give the listeners and viewers of this podcast kind of like some musical impressions of what techno sounded like at the time, and then also a bit like following through the evolution that other places like Frankfurt have done. So we'll start with this first song, and we're gonna listen to maybe all of it just to get a sense. Okay, maybe I'm not listening to everything, but I think it was important to give you a sense of like the early sound of techno. This was a track by Kevin Saunderson. So techno, despite its like seemingly like very straightforward structure, is a genre with like a complex kind of musical and ever-shifting history. So most people agree that Detroit is the birthplace of this kind of sound that we just listened to, or this kind of techno as we know it today, with its signature four on the floor beat driven by this like heavy kick drum, by like the deep kind of bass lines, and the snare or hi-hat on the second, fourth, and eighth notes. So the genre is really built on this kind of repetitive template with like these stabs coming in, but it's like ever evolving, allowing for like almost infinite variations. And some people like compared it to like the like much like a car assembly line can be modified to produce different models. So there's this kind of connection of Detroit being like one of the main hubs for the production of like North American cars. So its evolution, however, didn't happen overnight, but was shaped by various influences, including funk and disco, but also the electronic experimentation that happened in both America and in Europe. So Kraftwerk, for instance, is always cited as a big influence on people like Jeff Mills. So there's this kind of interplay that like some people credit for. And then you, of course, also have house music. So house music is an early precursor to techno involved in Chicago during the early 1980s. So DJs like Frankie Knuckles that you see here played a pivotal role in its development. So they've been taking apart disco's kind of glittering beats and reassembling them into something new. House music was embraced at Chicago's iconic club, The Warehouse, which gave the genre its name. Knuckle style, which featured this kind of loop beats and pulsing bass lines, already was something that you could also hear in the techno track that we listened to. So there's this kind of evolution that also came from house music at the time. And really became a sensation because it offered this kind of ecstatic sound that maintained disco's infectious rhythms and kind of like the pop character, while also pushing it into like new territory that kind of evolved later into techno as well. And I think this is something to highlight, and that makes some of the evolution quite different to the evolution in Germany, is that both techno and house music, like house, for instance, wasn't just a musical shift; it also served as kind of a socio-political response to a lot of events. One event of them being like the 1979 Disco Demolition Night, which symbolized a backlash against the Black and queer communities that had embraced disco in the past. So house music was kind of like a response to that. You can see a picture of here where like people actually smashed disco records, which still is kind of insane. And the pioneers, or like some of the pioneers of techno music in Detroit. So the sound of house quickly made its way to Detroit, where musicians like Huron Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, who you see on these two images, one when they were very young and one more recently, which were also known as the Belleville Three, further developed the house music sound into what would become techno. And they've been really influenced by the freeform radio stylings of Detroit's DJs like Electrifying Mojo and the mechanical minimalist sound of the German band Kraftwerk, like we've been talking, like I mentioned earlier. So they really fused this kind of like deep Chicago house music with the more like machine-like tones of electronic music from Europe in creating this new kind of like machine-like, but at the same time kind of groovy electronic music that we know today as techno, or more specifically Detroit techno. And it also played another role. Again, like I was saying earlier, there was a kind of socio-political angle to all of that. One of which was thinking about Afrofuturist ideas, and one of the techno bands, I would call them, or duos, that are often associated with that are Drexia, and we're going to listen to another track from them. only developed in Detroit, it really became infused, or some parts became infused with like the Afrofuturist ideas. So like imagining different futures for the Black American kind of population. And artists like Drexler really like embrace that and imagining this kind of underwater Black civilization that like have superpowers, and like the Detroit techno sound is kind of what like makes the world a world. So there was a certain kind of sociopolitical imaginary connected with Detroit techno, which also led to, or like which also was connected to the idea that Detroit techno scene was fiercely independent, with collectives like Underground Resistance, founded by Mike Banks and Jeff Mills, really pushing the boundaries of what techno could be, blending the music with this political and economic activism at the same time. So, and that was not only like a local kind of agenda, like Banks, for instance, created the Submerged distribution, which really also supported like Detroit techno's global reach, and like making sure that the message of that the stories that people had to tell would be heard, which also eventually led to the founding of Exhibit 3000, like the previously mentioned museum dedicated to preserving the true history and ethos of Detroit techno's movement. But now let's jump. Oh, I missed that Drexia slide. Here you have the underwater world. But now let's jump across the Atlantic to Frankfurt in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So Frankfurt is the area where I grew up. So that's why it's very like dear and important to me. That's where I grew up learning to love electronic music, going out. So this is like a very personal kind of story. So around the late 1980s and early 1990s, Detroit techno and Chicago house had already begun making their way into European clubs, and DJs in cities like Frankfurt were experimenting with these sounds. However, it also evolved. So one of the most important figures, at least in the Frankfurt scene, was a guy called Sven Fid, whose work would be pivotal in the rise of what came to be known as trance music. And trance music is really what made Frankfurt a key hub for electronic music at the time. And I'll go a bit more into like the evolution of trance music, which was not only influenced by Detroit techno and Chicago house. So a lot of the sayings that, okay, people just like appropriated the North American sound and like put their own label on it is what I really want to get into in this talk today. But before like talking a bit more about it, I just want to play you another track, one of the very early kind of trance tracks that came out of Frankfurt. And if you listen very carefully, you can actually hear that it is quite different from the previous sounds that we listened that came out of like North America. So for those who listen very closely, you could hear quite a difference. So the trance as a genre, it borrowed certainly elements from Detroit techno, but it was very distinct in its approach. So you still have the four on the floor kind of beat, but it's really characterized by melodies, and especially the kind of repetitive melodies that you could hear in this track as well, which melodies weren't really a big thing in original Detroit techno. You would have like stabs or like very like minimal kind of melodies that would come in at a certain point in time, but it wouldn't be this kind of very repetitive melodic phrases like the strong kind of atmospheric part that you could hear in this track. And it really was called trance because of that, because it had this ability to induce this kind of very hypnotic meditative state in listeners. And it, unlike techno, it also often features like very long build-ups and breakdowns and this sort of like climax that keeps listeners like in this prolonged state of trance. So while like techno and house like influenced it, trance actually drew from a range of other influences, including what is called electronic body music. So one of the very early inspirations, electronic body music, is a genre that emerged in Belgium and Germany around the 1980s. It was pioneered by bands like Front 242 and DAF, Deutsch-Amerikanische Freundschaft, which actually means German-American friendship. So they fused like this kind of repetitive driving beats of electronic music with the aggression aesthetics of industrial music. So they kind of took this driving beats of EBM and the kind of repetitiveness and put that together with the more like four on the floor techno sound, and also drawing inspiration from like ambient music and synth pop in order to create this kind of very atmospheric tracks. So there, like EBM is just one example of where trance kind of drew its inspiration from. All to say, or all to make the point that like trance music is not a copy and paste of like techno and house music. We're going to listen to another track of Sven Väth, who's actually like one of the big figures in Frankfurt. I have my personal like very conflicted history with Sven Väth. So this is not supposed to be like a love letter to him, but he played a very pivotal role as much as he's a controversial figure. It's called An Accident in Paradise. I think this is a good track that even goes further in like showing this very repetitive nature of trance. The early trance track might have sounded still a bit more similar to techno, but here you can really like hear the very different kind of repetitive bass line, weird, like yeah. So I think it's a good example. And Frankfurt really became a hub for this new kind of sound. We had the clubs like Omen and Dorian Gray, which was like in the Frankfurt airport, which hosted these marathon DJ sets that kind of blended like what came from North America, so techno, house music, EBM, but then really like started fusing that into this trance sound. And Sven Fade really was like a central figure in this movement. He really was known for his innovative kind of eclectic sets that would just like last hours and hours and hours and hours, and really took like people on this very transformative, like hypnotic journey through trance music. And Frankfurt really became a hub. My mom is a flight attendant, or used to be a flight attendant for Lufthansa, and she told me how there were actually chartered flights for people to like come from all over Germany and Europe on like specific flights that just took people to Frankfurt Airport to go to Dorian Gray to party for like 3 days straight. So like it had a lot of impact, but unlike the histories of like Detroit, this was really, I mean, you could argue that like hedonism is its own kind of political statement, but there was not really a political agenda behind this apart from like hedonistic partying. At least it was not expressed as such. If people might thought that that is rebellion in its own way, that's a whole nother story that maybe we can talk about later. Um, but yeah, it wasn't really this very sociopolitical or and economic kind of agenda that was driven here, and it was more connected to like pure hedonism. But Fade's influence really extended beyond the DJ booth. He founded IQ Records with Matthias Hoffmann and Heinz Roth, and IQ played really a pivotal role in developing what came to be known as this Frankfurt trance sound, melodic, euphoric, expansive. And a lot of like trance classics were released on that label. And later you also founded Hard House, which was focused a bit more on the harder experimental side of trance music. So really there was like a unique sound that shaped here in Frankfurt, which definitely was not techno. So like if Peter Feldman talks about Frankfurt is where techno has its origins, like exchange techno with trance, and the state and the statement would have been completely fine. But by just calling everything techno, this is where like we flatten history. Um, and that's really what I wanted to get at today. It's like let's call like electronic music nerds themselves might be very particular about what they call certain genres. So yeah, we just need to be a bit more particular of what we call things. That is all to say, I wanted to like get a big bit back into the bigger picture from this music focused things, because on a personal level, the relationship between like techno house and trance music serves kind of as a metaphor, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the past. So a metaphor for my own experience, like growing up as a mixed race person in West Germany, like the Afro-German experience, which was very different from the North American experience, and which is really why, like, when this moment thing came up, it really like sparked my own conflict with my own histories, especially like growing up during the 90s, which was quite really distinct from North America. And for that matter, also very distinct from like the what Paul Gilroy calls like the Black Europeanness in his work on the Black Atlantic, which really is like a UK, France, Caribbean, North American thing. But like the experience of like Afro Germans doesn't really fit in that. So, like, just as techno and house, pioneered by Black, queer, and working class communities in Detroit and Chicago, traveled to Europe and evolved into something new, like trance, like my own cultural identity was shaped by a diverse set of influences. So, growing up in the German countryside where people of color were far in between, I could not really relate at all to the Black American experience that I saw like represented in media and popular culture. So for the lack of other people in a similar position as me, I actually grew up believing that I was somehow white, but at the same time, something was different. So as we say, like I was a coconut, as we jokingly say. So like dark on the outside and white on the inside. So in Germany, my connections were more with other local immigrant groups like Italian, Turkish, and Arab communities rather than the Black communities that were more central to North America. But in the same way that trance music drew inspiration from techno, but fused it with other European electronic influences, my own identity was a blend of my German heritage, African American pop cultural influences, and then the diverse immigrant cultures I exchanged with. And I want to make this point because I think this multiplicity of cultural experiences situated in the German countryside shaped a rather particular Afro-German experience, which just as trans was a synthesis of various global and local sounds. And I think this Afro-German experience is only something that recently, through movements like Black Lives Matter, in the response to the incident, the murder of George Floyd, that this really became an issue. So conversations about Afro-German histories, which go back to actually Germany's colonial era, are slowly gaining attention. And while they are small Afro-German communities, we're only now starting to see a wider public recognition of the histories, but also contemporary Afro-German lives and histories. And inspired by the North American experience, I'm sometimes wondering what an Afro-German futurism would look like, and not like an Afrofuturism. So all that to say, um, the complex histories of electronic dance music, including those of techno, house, and trance, for me stand in like as a metaphor for larger historical issues at stake. And I think that's always something that we should remind ourselves of. So while I believe it is important to name things as they are, acknowledging the North American Black histories of electronic music, falling back into binary thinking on both sides, as the moment controversy sparked, is unintentionally affecting other marginalized communities that don't really fit into that binary thinking. So even potentially those folks who you're trying to protect. So I want to challenge us all to do better in raising this historical awareness, and I'm very happy that alt history is doing these kind of things. And one last thing I wanted to say, because people always tend to forget this, is that the significant American military presence in West Germany during the Cold War, particularly in the Frankfurt and Rhine-Main area, was like a very real thing. So when people say that like Germany appropriated techno or like black music for that matter, it's like, well, there were a lot of American military bases that were fortified in nearly every other town. We had tanks and military convoys regularly seen on the Autobahn deep into the 2000s, especially with like the Iraq wars and the Afghanistan wars. Like Germany was a big hub. So in a way, I was fortunate enough to have more first-hand experience because I could at one point enter these military bases, shop in the supermarkets, and go to the American barber and like see another layer of American cultural life in Germany. Yet at the same time, not living in American communities, but in a German village, made these visits almost like sightseeing experience in an American military theme park. So that is kind of the closing thing that I wanted to say, starting from music, going bigger to like complex histories that are oftentimes forgotten. So I generally believe that this impact of the long-standing presence of American armed forces on local communities, both negative and positive, deserves greater attention not only in German but also in American popular discourses. So the cross-cultural exchanges, such as found in the local, add a lot of layers to historical complexity that I feel are often overlooked. So while I don't know of any research that specifically focused on the influence of this presence on the evolution of electronic music in West Germany at large. I do know that like discotheques and parties were one of the foremost places where Germans and Americans actually met, including the one where my mother actually met my father. So I guess my attempt here was to just like raise a sort of situational awareness of a specific controversy that reflects upon larger historical trajectories, hypes, and silences. So while the Berlin electronic music scene is talked about a lot, I believe it was worthwhile highlighting the historical concept of Frankfurt's spot as a former trance epicenter. I'm not doing so in order to fuel like an artificial Frankfurt versus Berlin feud about who invented techno, but rather that similar to how Berlin's evolution was sparked by the fall of the Berlin Wall, so too West Germany had its very particular context, including the former American military occupation. And as you all know, techno was invented in Detroit, so if Bale's Frankfurt versus Berlin feud is not even the issue that we should be talking about. All to say, I just wish to caution against letting our current day angers and frustrations cloud our view of the past, which I really think is what happened with the MoMEM controversy. And like it was sparked at a time where we talked a lot about like issues which were very polarizing, but that actually like let us flatten histories that are a lot more complex. So while the whitewashing and the appropriation and the commercialization of electronic music of the past 30 or so years, like best exemplified by branding everything under the homogenizing term techno, without any form of reciprocity to the queer and colored folks that originally pioneered the genre, is definitely a real thing. I think it is responding to these histories by equally reducing this other histories is not really what we need. So like we need to do better is what I'm trying to say. So let's not only listen to the music, but through the music, let's listen to each other.
Wow. Um, Maurice, you blew my mind with the bit about the military bases. Because I know Detroit histories. I grew up in Southern Ontario, and my influences were, I don't know, New York and Detroit, and I knew Detroit was the one for me. And in all the Detroit mythology, like how Germany got to Detroit was like the electrifying mojo and played on the radio, right? And how did
Yeah.
America get to Germany? Military bases. That's quite the stark contrast, like of the presence and footprint, and just that's super fascinating. And the fact that your parents met at a disco is, I feel like that was the key biographical detail I never knew about you, but I needed to know.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they played electronic music there,
Sure.
but I mean, they were definitely like in every town that had a military base, there were
Yeah.
several kind of discotheques and bars that were catered to like
Right.
American military personnel and like people that are were just into like
Yeah.
meeting with Americans.
Yeah, like mixery
Yeah.
type in between spaces. Um, I guess let's do an interesting question first because one of the like the contra I'm gonna throw something Kadu Eshwin said wrote 25 years ago at you. It's a bit provocative and facetious, but maybe it'll lead to somewhere interesting because this one of I feel like your story, a lot of what you told reminds me of how problematic like and how narrow genres are and how totalizing they can be, and using something like techno to describe many different variants of electronic music like geographic or whatever emerging from different communities, like how narrow that is. But anyways, and more brilliant than the sun, which I can't believe is 25 years old. Kodo Ishwin wrote, for techno, Dusseldorf is the Mississippi Delta. So he kind of flipped the script, and I think he's being facetious here a little bit, but to kind of like rhetorically saying like Detroit musicians stole the Kraftwerk and Dusseldorf sound and made it their own in the same way that white rock musicians stole R&B and blues. Well, they did. I shouldn't do that in air quotes there. And I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, like, if we kind of, I hate the first, I hate like stressing really about who's first and who owns something, right? I think that's problematic, but like, where does Kraftwerk for you specifically fit into this? And like, where do you kind of think about them, the role that they play? Obviously, a massive role in both Germany and America. Like, I don't know. I just love to hear your thoughts on this.
I mean, I think Kraftwerk played like a very pivotal role in the
Yeah.
history of electronic music at large. I mean, as we saw through what I was talking about earlier, both Detroit techno and trance like reference Kraftwerk or like the Düsseldorf sound kind of
Yeah.
as a key influence. And I think it's even larger than that. Like last weekend, we're actually celebrating my partner's birthday, and I ended up like Spotify DJing, and my partner's father, who grew up in communist Romania, really loves Kraftwerk.
Mm.
So I played Kraftwerk, and we're like in this backyard in Brossard, in like in the suburbs of Montreal, and I'm like listening to what is arguably like the first kind of popular electronic music that really reached
Yeah.
like far, like it reached to communist Romania, which didn't even have access to Western media. at all. So like pirate radios were playing Kraftwerk to the communist bloc, and that also just like blows my mind. So
Yep.
I think the influence of Kraftwerk cannot be like understated on a lot of folks. But I wouldn't say that
Yeah.
Düsseldorf is the Mississippi
Yeah,
Delta.
of course. I mean that book is full of big swings. I just love
It
it.
is,
It's a
it is.
juicy one, but I just
Yeah,
I often see these two camps sometimes. Like Detroit invented it, Kraftwerk invented it, and it's like it's not productive in this, you kind of added nuance to the objection around the music
yeah.
in Germany. Like
I think there's the whole like power relationship to it,
yeah,
right? It's like if the people that don't have the power take something,
of
it's
course.
sampling, and if the people in power take something, then it's like appropriation. Which I mean, I study this a lot, and that there's definitely truth to that, but that extends far beyond the music itself. That extends to like the socio-political and economic realities of the places where things are happening. So like Kraftwerk in Düsseldorf probably were in a better economic place than
Of
I don't
course. Yeah, yeah.
I would
I've
think
from
so.
what there's a book called Future Music, Future Kraftwerk, Future Music from Germany. I can't remember the scholar's name, but the
Yeah,
subtext I got, I read a chunk of it, and like Kraftwerk kind of had a blank check for the studio,
yeah,
right? And that's pretty different than the
exactly.
Detroit musician orange stories. Like nobody was kind of wealthy and from day zero or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Which
so
leads
this,
just to like very situated histories is what I'm saying. It's like
yep,
the power disbalance is for sure like a certain like is important to address, but you need to see things in context. You can't just like say, okay, the Germans are rich and they
yeah,
invented and then they reappropriated. Not to say that the whole appropriation of techno and the commercialization by like white folks and just like making it a huge business that doesn't really reciprocate to like the Black and queer communities. That's definitely a real thing.
yeah,
But that's a history that might have started like in the 90s, but that was not what the 90s were about. So that's what I'm trying to say. I think there might be some amount of blame to put on folks, but it wasn't even the conversation at the time that we're having now, right? So like I
yeah,
was saying, like the Frankfurt scene was very much about hedonism. I don't think they thought about like sociopolitical action at
of
all.
course, yeah.
I mean,
And
Love
that
Parade
if
was
we're
also supposed to be
yeah,
like an apolitical space. It
right.
was like, we're not talking about politics at all here, which I mean, it's very naive.
Yeah. And UK was its own thing. I mean, okay, they were just
Exactly.
hedonists, but also Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah,
So it was partying, being blitzed under austerity. So shares hedonism.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, you went there with like kind of broader electronic music. I had a question I was going to bring up later, but it might be good. Like just this like EDM as another word that's problematic and forgetful, perhaps. Like, okay, in the 90s and 2000s, we had these, I was laughing at the Sven Vath photo, like everybody kind of looking very 90s. And but like, okay, it was still fringe, but now, Skrillex and Fortet and Fred again can fill Madison Square Gardens for a dance party. Um, how do you kind of think? Because I know, I mean, you curate serious electronic music festivals, and EDM is a term we turn our nose up at generally. How do you kind of think about this kind of commercial EDM world? Like, where do you kind of trance and techno fit into it? Or do they?
Well, I mean, I think so. Yeah, we put our nose ups when we hear like EDM because we think about, I don't know, Avicii and Armin van Buuren
Yeah.
and like all these who actually like started out as trance DJs. So there's definitely this
Yep.
lineage of like 90s trance that was first in Germany, but then also simultaneously developed in the Netherlands that kind of became this huge thing for a while. I'm not sure how big it still is. I actually don't follow it too much. I
Yeah.
know the hard techno thing is like the new kind of EDM
Yeah.
takeover that the kids are into. But I mean, like in Germany at least, and I think in other places, it's like in the 90s, trance would fill stadiums. Like the
Yep.
Love Parade would have like millions of people
Yeah.
going there. So I'm not sure how different that is from like the modern day EDM. I think
Yeah.
it's waves of popularity. And then, I mean, like people would love for themselves to like call themselves underground, like underground techno scene, and then you go to like Ibiza and like the water costs 15 euros, and people are like, this is the underground. This is like, this is not the underground. This is not the underground at all. This is so overground.
Yeah.
So there's also, yeah, Berghain is not underground. It's like, it's very much
Well,
popular culture.
no,
And I
normies
think
know
there's this
about
kind
it.
of,
It's a normie trope. Like, can I get in? I mean, that's what
yeah,
the and the
exactly.
bait, it's a reductive trope, but
Exactly. And I think people have a difficult time to kind of accept that. It's like true underground culture is like not in those spaces. And people that came from the underground might have a difficult time to accept that they're not underground anymore because they might have seen themselves, so they might have grown up as like being the misfits and like being the
yep.
rebels. But if you like charge 25,000 euros for a DJ set, like I'm sorry, like you're not underground and your party is not underground if your like
Yeah.
water costs 15 euros. And I think that's maybe like a bit of nostalgia towards the past, because yeah, like people came from these histories, so people might have like issues to like um, but yeah, I think that so we should what all I'm trying to say is like people that think that they're in the underground electronic music scene are probably very overground and they shouldn't be snobby about like popular music like EDM and it's like at I don't know Tomorrowland or Awakenings or whatever the
Sure.
festivals are. If the kids like it, it's like who am I to say that
Yeah. It
that
words
that's not
relative,
good?
I guess. I mean, go to a noise show and then you're reminded of one, where it's like 15 people and seven of them are musicians.
Exactly.
Like that's
Welcome
truly,
to the underground.
yeah. Well, here's one question, and this is partially selfish because I have very limited experience with Berlin techno. I have been to Tresor. I've never been to Berghain. And the last time I was in Berlin, Potsdamer Platz was a construction site. So I only know Berlin techno through releases, vinyl at one point, streaming, and then live sets in North America. Is this kind of the place in the world where the link between American dance music and German dance music is not a big deal and kind of figured out intrinsically? Like how does techno and trance, how do they manifest themselves in Berlin, the sound of Berlin today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I'm definitely not a historian,
Sure.
but
I mean, what you hear is
if you
really what
think
I'm
about
asking. Yeah.
if you like listen to Dimitri Hegemann or like you
Yeah.
read this book Klang der Familie, I'm not sure if there's an English version, which kind of outlines that the early histories of Berlin techno. You can very much see that like the initial was really like on eye level, like folks like Cosmic JD, etc. They would go from Berlin to Detroit, and they would invite like underground resistance to like come play at Tresor, like the original Tresor, and it
Yeah.
was kind of this mix. I think like Jeff Mills even like met the guys from Kraftwerk at Tresor in like the early 90s. So there was definitely like the kind of again this kind of controversial history that we're trying to reproject based on the angers that we have today
Right.
on these early days. I think that's an issue because if you look closely, there definitely was like a lot more cross-fertilization and collaboration on eye level where like the folks in Berlin bought so many records from like the Detroit folks, or like the invention of like dub techno was really a collaboration between
Hmm.
like basic channel rhythm is sound and like the artists in Jamaica, the artists in the UK to kind of craft this new sound which we now call dub techno.
Yeah.
So I think yeah, like highlighting like definitely like highlighting like the issues that are there, but not like also highlighting like the things that worked well, because I think focusing on the things that work well are actually the pieces that we might need in order to like reconstruct our like musical infrastructures, musical collaborations, like focusing on the success stories that were at a high level, while of course being attentive of things that might not have worked as they should have
Yeah.
is important.
The dub techno reference is another good point for like the influence is murky and there's lots of stuff like I know Moritz von Oswald mixed the second half of Juan Atkins' first album in
Yeah,
1995. Like Juan Atkins handed over the mixing duties to freaking more like that's, Germany comes to Detroit again.
Yeah,
First we had Kraftwerk and then we had him. Wow. Okay. Well, here's another question. We've talked about America and Germany a bunch, but a chunk of your experience in music programming is for Japanese audiences, right? And again, I have not been to Japan, and I have endless fascination with so many things about Japanese culture, including its electronic music and certainly its instruments. Could you talk a little bit your MUTEK Japan, how it explored techno and maybe its history? I mean, without biting off another huge thing we don't have time to finish, but I'm just kind of curious where these thoughts fit into the work that you did there and your experience of the city musically.
sure. So here comes like the full loop of how I got to actually be involved in electronic dance music more than just going to parties. Was I moved to Japan in 2011, 12, I think. And what happened was that my sister, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this, but I mean, people know. She was dating Sven Fate at the time for like 3, 4 years. So she came together with Sven to Japan, and we had a dinner at like the Hyatt Regency, and I met Sven Fate and like his local Japanese friends, who would become my collaborators in starting like MUTEK Japan. So that's why
Ah,
I'm saying I have like a very conflicted personal history with Sven, because
right.
in a way, like I owe him like a bit, because without him, I wouldn't actually have met all these amazing people in Japan that I've been working with.
Sure.
At the same time, other things happen, but that's okay. We don't need to get into that. But that's where it really all started. So like we had this dinner, and you sometimes you have this one moment in time where it's like this is one of the moments where just like my life changed, and like that's like a pivotal kind of moment. And I pin it to that dinner because I met all these people who I then started like getting involved with, and we would like be running the Cocoon, Sven's label, the Cocoon shows in Tokyo, where we would come like every year, like every actually several times per year. It's also like the events where I first started my own like electronic live set with a collaborator, where we played like live electronic music at these parties, and that's really how it started. And then speaking about EDM, it was like in 2014, 15 when the club culture in Japan changed quite radically. Like a bunch of clubs closed, and the ones that were still there were struggling for survival. And they really started shifting towards the more like popular EDM sound, that was popular at the time. So we kind of saw the space for underground electronic music, or the kind of electronic music that we liked at the time, like fading away or slipping away in Tokyo. And that's really when the idea of like starting a festival like came about, in order to kind of react to that, carving out spaces, not only for the kind of music that we were like, the more experimental, the more left field music that we were into, but also to create spaces for like encouraging young Japanese artists, like giving them spaces to develop themselves, which on like bigger stages, because in Tokyo is like a very kind of, a lot of things happen in small spaces where it's like, this is a DJ bar, this is a music bar that fits 20 people. So a lot of people like develop their craft there, but they don't really get a lot of chances to play on big stages that much, unless they're like they need. So there's a certain protectiveness in certain parts of the club culture, where it's like, unless you're like already really really established, it's really hard for folks to actually get the chance to play
Yeah.
like the main room, etc.
And
So
I guess that's something MUTEK has always done is put like promising and tested local artists on stage with big international figures.
exactly. So that was kind of the approach, and that's why like MUTEK became so interesting for us as a concept, because it really had those roots in like promoting the local, or like assisting, developing, and promoting the local scene, locally, but then eventually also like on a more international level.
Yeah.
So that's been really nice to see actually some of the artists that we started working with very early on, like Makina, for instance, like a Korean electronic musician, that now is like playing alongside Richie Hart in like the biggest places. Like when we met her in 2016, 17, she was playing in a tiny bar, and it was great. And not to say like all the credit goes to her for being amazing, but it's a story where it's like we've been working with her over the years, and you could see the artists grow alongside by just giving rooms for like experimentation and like opportunities. So it's been like a really nice thing to see. And I think the same happened with like other artists. And then I mean, Japanese electronic music, like the production quality and the attention to detail, we all know that's like what Japan is known for, and that definitely goes into the electronic music realm. I think like one of the best, most like not most, but some of the best electronic music tracks are made by Japanese folks who are just yeah, very geeky and very into the attention to detail. And yeah, it's a great place for electronic music. It's the scene is small, but like what is there is like it's first class.
I am going to follow up with you after this conversation for a playlist because I have my historical roots, my Sakamoto's and Yellow Magic Orchestra offshoots, and I know some weirdos from the 90s, but I have to admit I'm pretty ignorant about a lot of more recent electronic artists there. So that's another conversation. Well, we've been talking for an hour, so maybe we can bring things full circle to wind up.
Sure.
And we started with the museum, and you talked about the controversy. Did anything positive come out of that discussion, and was there any reframing uh, for that trance museum? Maybe, I don't know what to call it. Electronic Music History Museum. Was there any kind of
Well,
proper response, or not really? Was it just kind of a controversy that
I
flared and there
mean,
was a dialogue?
I'm not sure how much of a dialogue there was.
Okay.
Like the people running the museums, like me, they're definitely not historians, and they
Yeah.
didn't do their research properly, and they might not be the best to express like what this museum is actually about.
Mhm.
So if you call it a trans museum, having like the opening exhibition about Sven Feth makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But if you call it a techno museum, then
Right.
having the opening exhibition about Sven Feth doesn't make that much sense. Overall, I haven't been in a while. My
Yeah.
mother actually has been to like a hip hop exhibition there, and she had, so I'm not sure if it's like the damage from like this initial controversy that kind of took the steam out of the museum. It
Yeah.
seems that it's not really the place that it aspired to be, which is unfortunate because I met the people before and we actually discussed with them before the museum opened about like collaborations, including like collaborations with MUTEK because it seemed like an
Mhm.
exciting like avenue to explore. But yeah, I don't nothing has come out of that, and I'm not sure what the future of the this museum will actually
Yeah.
be, which is a shame because I mean they've been lobbying the government for like a decade, and the location of the museum is like in the center of Frankfurt. So
Yeah.
there were good intentions there, but also a lot of naivety, which led to like this opening controversy. And yeah, I'm not really aware of what the future will hold for that space,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem to be going super well.
Yeah, well, probably also like whether it's Kraftwerk, Sven Väth, which I've said wrong my entire life and didn't realize until this conversation, or artists from Detroit, I don't know, Underground Resistance. Like as soon as you're putting future music in a museum, I guess Detroit has done a homegrown, narrow version of it that seems to kind of work in Czech, but
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to put the future in amber. You know what I mean? Like there's a
That's a good
resistance
point.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
maybe that's as good as a place for alt history to end today as we're going to get to. Thank you so much for your generosity, Maurice. I learned a lot. I was listening with rapt attention.
Thank
And like I
you for
said, you
having
blew
me.
my mind with the stuff around the military bases in particular, to say nothing of the young Maurice picks.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure and
Yeah.
great work you're doing here with the alt history. Very
Great.
important.
Okay. Well, folks, tune in for our next session, which I believe will air in November with the American designer and archivist Mindy Sue. See you then.